Yeah. Hello, thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk for probably about 55 minutes or so. If you do want to interject with questions, feel free as we go along, or we'll just also do questions at the end. I'll just keep going like a steam train otherwise. Normally I would kind of go on a long rant about sound in the first half of this, but I'm not going to do that this time, so you kind of get off lightly, and I'm going to focus on a series of different projects that I work on with my company. But I want to sort of start just with a kind of background, and I thought it would make sense to kind of go through a series of projects in terms of the trajectory that took me from where I started as a musician and an audio engineer through to what I'm doing now with Circumstance. So my beginnings were in composition and music and sound engineering, and I sort of became an artist by accident because I became interested in working on documentaries, and it was at a period where documentaries were shifting. Especially I'd moved to Bristol in the UK, and I moved there because I had a lot of records from that city, and it seemed like a sensible reason to move to a city that you liked all the music from. So I kind of moved there, and when I moved there they started shifting towards trying to explore interactive television, interactive documentaries. And I bought a computer and sat down and learned how to use a computer and started working in that field. Unfortunately, none of the ideas I wanted to make would get broadcast, and no one wanted to broadcast them. But galleries were interested, and turned out I was making interactive art and digital art, and I sort of accidentally became an artist and went, okay, this is fine, as long as someone's going to pay me for making what I wanted to make, I'll be an artist. So I spent a lot of time working with interactive installations, sort of video tracking things and soundscapes in rooms and gallery spaces. And I then started becoming involved in the sort of early video blogging scene. Just kind of as YouTube was being launched, there was a community of us all trying to basically put small videos online, and it was incredibly hard to do. It's weird looking back at it now and remembering the sort of people coming into the forums on the message boards and going, yeah, so we're going to start this service called YouTube, and we're trying to decide whether we should make it with Flash video or QuickTime movies, and everyone was saying, oh, you should make it with QuickTime movies so people can download them and share them, and they were saying, oh no, but then we won't have any property rights. And so it was quite an exciting period in a way. But for me, I wanted to carry on making documentaries, and I basically started making these tiny sort of 20, 30-second pieces that I was publishing on a blog each week. And they were literally just, well, I'm going to show you a couple, but they're literally just single shot takes that I would then write a soundtrack to, or I'd have a soundtrack and I'd shoot a short bit of video with it. So I'm just going to show you a couple of those. So for me, what was really important that they were all single shot takes of things that were just happening around me, kind of these unstaged moments. It was almost a sort of desire to be really pure about documentary practice.
that you do to go and help them. And this is what friendship is for me. You put the other person's welfare before your own.
So I was making a lot of this work, but at the same time I was sort of becoming frustrated with making work online, essentially. Coming from a background of live performance through music and theatre, there was something frustrating about the nature, for various reasons, of making things online. But there was also something about this intimacy. We were publishing videos and 15 people would watch them. You were really sharing them with just a few other people, which was kind of nice, but there were things that were slightly frustrating about it. And I was also in a period where I was really interested in acoustic ecology, this kind of appreciation of the sound around us. So I never wore headphones, I never used a Walkman or an MP3 player. And I also wasn't really interested in mobile media at all. I had a real obsession with just trying to see the world as I walked around and took it in. And these were the things that led to filming these little short moments. And I felt I could only really see these moments if I was completely alert all the time. And I had a kind of a sort of epiphany moment, I guess. I started working with Hewlett-Packard on research into located media, into mobile devices that use GPS and satellite positioning to trigger different bits of content. And when I started working with them, I'd kind of been asked to try something with this system, and the first thing I did was go out listening to soundtracks I'd written for these documentaries, hearing them triggered in different locations. And what happened was I just saw the films I'd been making in real life. So I suddenly found myself sort of standing on a corner listening to the soundtrack and seeing an event play out in front of me. And had this, it was that kind of moment where it was like, oh, actually, there is a way I could use this idea of small soundtracks of real situations to make content. And for me, it was a way of thinking, this is a way I want to make documentaries. It means I get to have people in the real world, but I get to frame that world through soundtracks. And it's a way of thinking about cinema that's carried on through everything else we've done. So I want to, I do just want to put a caveat in that I quite often tend to use the term real and real world when I'm talking about situations and things I'm making, which is philosophically, it's a problematic term to talk about the real. Sorry, that's all right. I haven't found a better way of describing it yet. What I would say is that I do think we as a company are still making documentaries, which I'll sort of come back to a bit more as we go on, but the type of documentaries we make go back to the early 20th century approaches to documentary. And John Grierson, who coined the term documentary, talked about it as the creative treatment of actuality. And the documentaries that were being made in the 20s and 30s, and some a bit earlier, were this kind of approach where they would film the world, really everyday situations, especially in a post-war climate in the UK, where the world was boring. After the First World War, suddenly everything was boring, and the General Post Office were making lots and lots of films that, to some extent, were just saying, no, this is good. All that war stuff, it was really exciting, but it's not good, honestly. People delivering letters and living and baking bread, this is really good. So they were kind of making these beautiful films that were tributes to this everyday world and this everyday life. And they would be films, but they would have poetry written with them, they'd have musical scores written with them. They were very, very beautiful poetic pieces. I think the term, the creative treatment of actuality, is one I've sort of stuck with quite a lot. But I found this while I was looking into this as a documentary, as a definition of documentary in a very sort of leaden, boring dictionary of film terminology. But I really like the specificity of it, where it says a non-fiction film, if we ignore the the word film in this. The documentary is usually shot on location, actual persons rather than actors. Social, environmental, their purpose is to enlighten, inform, educate, persuade and provide insight into the world in which we live. And for me it's kind of, yeah, okay, I want to do that. At heart, I think I'm still a naive hippie, and I make work and I make art because I think somewhere I can have some impact on the world, and somewhere I can change things in one small way somewhere. And it's probably quite an idealistic goal, but yes, I still keep trying. As I go on through some of the projects, I would also say that because of this obsession with the real and the experience, we don't document our work very well. So I also quite often just be showing pictures that aren't actually any work we've made, and they're just things that inspire us as we go along, and things that have led to ideas rather than actually the work. I'll tell you when it is the work. But first I want to talk about agendas and these reasons for making work. So I have a fundamental belief, I guess, that mobile technology is great. It connects us to different people in faraway places. It lets us access content and things that we would never know normally around us, yet at the same time it creates a distance between what's happening next to us, both the people and the places around us. And part of the thinking behind almost everything we make is somehow trying to address this. And sorry, I ate too quickly in the KASKlezing. Some of what we're trying to do is address this for us, a fundamental problem in the urban condition, this sense of isolation and disconnection that happens. And we use, sorry, I was trying in the cafe as well to translate the word squalor, which kind of means dirt, grime, grim conditions around you. And we use mobile technology, we use headphones, we use MP3 players, we use things that normally are designed to cut you off and separate you from the world, and we try and use them to force you to connect with the world. Michael Bull, who is one of the only people who's kind of written a lot about iPod culture and the notions of this kind of mobile listener in the city, he talks a lot about this idea of warm and chilly spaces, this idea that what we do is we make our personal bubble warmer all the time. So we're listening to the music we want to listen to, we're making the connections we want to connect with. But what that does is it makes the outside world chillier, it makes the social space chillier, and this becomes a kind of vicious circle where, as that becomes colder, it makes us even more want to sit at the train station connecting to friends on Facebook, because the person on the bench next to you is also tied into their phone connecting to someone else on Facebook, and you're not talking to them, they're talking to someone else, you might as well talk to someone else in a remote place. And these are kind of some of the fundamental ideas that we try and, I guess, combat in the work. In terms of thinking about cinema, we kind of say that everything we make and all the projects I'm going to describe, we talk about as making cinema without cameras. Partially because in this tough age of trying to get arts funding and commissions and audiences, you need to come up with really cool sentences to describe what you do. And cinema without cameras, it sounds like a nice thing, and people go, "Ooh, what's that?" But there is a kind of serious element to it for us, which is this strength and this history of the soundtrack in film. I'm gonna come back to the word soundtrack later, but there's something really important about the way music works over images, and it's the easiest way for me to describe it, I think, is is the difference in temporality, the idea that music is a temporal form, it happens over time. And by combining music with fixed images, you change the temporal nature of that image. So if you have a fixed image where nothing's happening, but you add a piece of sound to it, suddenly you add a time frame to that image. And in cinema, this comes down to the fixed camera shot with a pulsing piece of music suddenly gives it tension. A slow, drawn-out piece of music gives it a slower, more sort of reflective shape, and vice versa. And for us, we treat the eye as the camera, and we use the soundtrack as a way of framing the world. So what we're doing all the time is we're kind of asking people to see the world as a film. The underlying idea behind this is that people pay attention to media, and people pay attention to films, because if someone films something, it takes on a sort of gravitas. People think it must be more important. So the idea for us is that, what if we just make people look at the world with the same level of concentration they look at the film, then in the end, the world will be a better place. Because suddenly, everyone starts paying attention to each other, and somehow this solves the fundamental problem, and everyone's happy, and war ends, and poverty solved, and famine, and all that stuff. We haven't quite got there yet, but what we have found is that by drawing attention to the everyday, and by drawing attention to the really small things, you find beauty in the details, and you find moving moments, you find loss, tragedy, trauma, you find all the things that you would in the greatest pieces of cinema, these epic pieces of filmmaking, but it's kind of all really just sitting there. And sometimes we say we're lazy filmmakers because of this idea that if we want a crowd scene, we're going to put our audience in a busy street. If we want to make a, well, I'm probably not going to make something in an anatomish room, but this is where I put the audience. But really, in the end, it's about trying to make people pay attention to what's around them, with the idea that in the long run, they keep doing that after the experience we've created. And I guess we also use music because, or we start our projects with music because it lets us say the things that you can't say without words. And we also walk a lot. We walk, most of our pieces are pedestrian. And there's a few reasons for this. One is I really like walking. Secondly, as Francis Alice said, it's in this kind of speed culture that we have now, walking acts as a kind of resistance. And it also lets you experience the world at a pace that your body can compute. We've evolved to the speed of walking. Cycling is great. I'm not knocking cycling. Love cycling, but we haven't evolved to deal with the speed of cycling yet. Our bodies and our experiences and our senses, cycling hasn't been around long enough for us to adapt to that. So walking allows you to kind of experience the world with the detail that we've developed. So I want to talk about the work we make. That's kind of the idea of the talk. So I'm going to talk about 3 types of pieces. One is something we make called a subtle mob, which we've run a couple of here in Ghent. I don't know how many people here have. Did anyone here come to either of the ones at Almost Cinema we've done in the last 2 years? A couple of people. Okay, so I can explain it and it won't be too. I can make it sound better than it was, and just don't tell them if you go into it. So a subtle mob. These started from sound walks. I was making a lot of work where the audience was asked to put on a pair of headphones and listen to something walking around a place. So kind of like a museum guide, except they'd be fictional, they'd have soundtrack, they'd give you kind of instructions to do things. And a couple of things started happening when I did this. Firstly, every so often I would use funny bits of technology with it, and you would be able to see the other people taking part. And quite often audiences would come back and they would say, oh yeah, so I was walking along and I saw this other person doing it, and we sort of smiled at each other and we had this connection, like, yeah, I know what you're doing, you know what I'm doing. And people really loved that. And this for me was a really important thing, because suddenly there were these connections happening in public spaces between strangers, just because they thought they were both listening to the same thing. Now, one of the ideas around Walkmans and around mobile listening is that this hierarchy happens in social spaces, where if you see someone with headphones on, they're hearing something that you don't know what it is. You don't know what they know. They know more than you. They are suddenly at a higher position than you because they have knowledge that you don't. And this is one of the ideas around why mobile phone conversations are frustrating to hear. It's got nothing to do with the fact that someone's just shouting on a mobile phone going, "I'm on the train!" It's actually just because they're hearing something that you're not hearing, and we suddenly feel we're in this hierarchical structure. It's one idea. So I also noticed that when people are walking around doing these sort of sound walks, they move and they act differently. Even though you've just given them something to listen to, there's a certain walk that people take on. And now it's kind of, if I see someone walking on with headphones on, I can pretty much tell whether they're actually listening to music, the radio, on the phone, or doing some arty sound walk, because the sound walk people have this sort of walking along and then they'll stop, and they'll sort of look at something for no apparent reason. And then they'll sort of walk off again. And then they'll smile like this. I mean, they could be just mad, but generally you can sort of tell when someone's engaged in the experience that's talking about the place they're in. And this idea of the listener as a performer became interesting to me, that we weren't just making content that was existing in the ears of the listener, we were making something that suddenly existed in the streets. Suddenly the way they were acting was going to have an impact and some kind of change in what was happening. Not a big change, nothing really noticeable, just a small, subtle change. And I was also making some theatre works where the audience were kind of walking around with headphones on, but we wanted the whole world to feel a bit different. So we made a set of instructions for volunteer performers to follow. So all these volunteer performers would be in the streets of the city listening to instructions to tell them to pick up a bag of shopping, to open the door. So that for the theatre audience, they're walking along and suddenly they see someone sort of picking up some shopping, but at the corner of the aisle they see someone else doing it, and then over there they see someone else doing it, but before they've sort of realised what's happening, all these people have disappeared and stopped. And we didn't want these people following the instructions to be performance slaves, so we gave them some music as well, and we sort of gave them a bit of a story, and they loved it. And then we thought, well, why bother making the theatre show? Let's just make this kind of set of instructions that people could follow and make the show themselves for each other. And this is where the Subtle Mob started. So the idea with a Subtle Mob is it's a sort of reaction to flash mobs. So does everyone know what a flash mob is? These kind of the sort of mass gatherings where everyone would sort of freeze in a train station, or suddenly everyone would start dancing in the airport or something like that. Has everyone seen these on YouTube? They have like 7 million hits, so in theory everyone's seen them. But the problem for me was that more people see them on YouTube than are ever actually there. So we sort of wanted to make something that where you had to be there. And we also didn't want to make a spectacle. We didn't want to make just a big show that everyone looks at and sees. We really wanted to try and make something that's kind of invisible, that just bleeds into the everyday and just becomes part of the world. So we wanted people to follow instructions that were simple and based on everyday actions. And in the end, it's that moment of connecting with someone else, but doing it with lots and lots of people. So we've done this with, I think the largest one is just over 1,000 people, all trying to sort of, we had to spread that over 5 or 6 city blocks to actually keep it discreet. When we did the pieces in Ghent, we actually were really surprised by the amount of people that came to the first one, and it ended up being quite obvious actually, as far as subtle mobs go. But just to give you an idea of what people are hearing, they're hearing a mixture of instructions and music and narrative. So I'm just going to play you an extract and then kind of explain how it works.
My name is Jess, and I'm going to be guiding you through this experience. Some of the time you'll just be watching what's going on around you, as if you're in the cinema. But sometimes I'm going to ask you to do certain things, so you'll become actors in this film. Don't worry, there's nothing embarrassing or dangerous. In fact, you're almost just going to be playing yourselves. So when you hear my voice, you'll know there's an instruction coming. So let's start very simply. Stay where you are and look down at your feet. Look carefully at the ground beneath you. Right now, you're here, and you're not alone. Keep looking at the ground. You can't see them all right now, but around you are friends and strangers. Now, raise your head very slowly and take in everything around you. This vision, this street, the people in this place, to your left and to your right. Stay where you are for now, in this moment. Savour it, as if it were the last time.
I decided to record this because when I ask you what you'll miss, you'll say the parks and the Sunday lunches, you'll say the cricket.
I'm going to turn this bit down and talk over it because it's my voice and it'll just be weird hearing that and then hearing me. You could just stand like this dramatically. No, I can't say this.
You told me about the people leaving, and I'm feeling
So what you're hearing there is the first two voices that the audience will hear. The first one is the voice that gives them instructions and asks them to do simple things. Look at the ground, slowly look up. As the piece goes on, it asks them to put their hand on their friend's shoulder, to look at their reflection in the window. All very small, simple actions. And what we've actually done is we've sent out different MP3s. So while half the audience is following an instruction, the other half of the audience is hearing a description of that scene. When they hear that description, they start looking around, they start seeing this happening. And at the beginning, no one knows who else is taking part. So what kind of happens for the audience is, it seems like this fictional story is actually suddenly taking place in the world around them. I think this. No, it's still me. And this role swaps backwards and forwards throughout the piece. So sometimes you're following instructions, sometimes you're being described the world around you, and it sort of accelerates and becomes a kind of blur as it goes on. I'm just seeing if one of the narrative description should come in there. Obviously left off the narrative description. That's okay. This is what's actually happening. I made a diagram. So you're doing it in pairs, listening to the MP3, and while one group's description is it's very simple. But it becomes a very, very complex system when it actually happens, because people are always starting their MP3 players slightly different times to each other. So you get this kind of flickering of action, so that the moments where someone's asked to run back to their partner, you see one person running, then another, then another, then another. And that makes it kind of more fluid and slightly more invisible. In terms of the process for making these pieces, is kind of what I sort of wanted to talk about. Is these are, and the reason I say they're documentaries is because we have a documentary approach to making them. All the instructions and all the actions that people are following during the piece are essentially the same kind of reenactments you'd stage when you were making a documentary. The first, not the first, but Nanook of the North, which was a documentary from, I'm going to forget the year now. Anyone know the year of Nanook of the North? 1908? 1908. A documentary about Inuits around the North Pole. Flaherty, who made it, filmed them all, doing all their stuff, went home to edit it, accidentally set fire to all the film, went back and said, "Can you do it all again? The stuff you did, but more dramatically." That was the first piece of work kind of coined as a documentary. It was looked at as a classic documentary, and it was all reenacted and all changed slightly. What we did when we made this piece is we started with interview material, so we started interviewing people around the themes of the work, and you know, as much as we make work with agendas, we make work with personal reasons as well. This piece was written for my late brother-in-law, and we started asking people what they would miss if they couldn't go home again. And from this kind of interview material, we'd work with a group of performers, we'd go out with this text, and we'd read it to ourselves, read it to each other, watching the world, and look for scenes that essentially kind of seemed to suit this text, seemed that they could be these people, this story could match these people. And we'd already written some ideas for music, so we'd stand there, we'd watch the world, listening to our soundtracks, reading the text, and we'd see something and go, that's it, that's those people there in that shop, or those people on that street corner, this could be their story. And we'd notate everything they were doing, and then we'd turn it into a performance, and then we turn it into instructions. So these are two of our performers, restaging a scene, turning it into instructions. Later, that becomes an audience. These are two people taking part in the subtle mob who are following the instructions to recreate that scene. So what you're getting is something that we saw happen on the streets of Bristol between two people now has been played out in numerous different situations, but the scene is always the same, the soundtrack is the same. Essentially, it's a documentary, I think, isn't it? It's also, for me, that when you follow the instructions, you're then embodying the story yourself as well. You're taking on board this story by kind of living it and by performing it. So you're not just seeing other people doing it and hearing the narrative, you're also then following the instructions and carrying it out yourself. And depending on where you are in the diagram, you might have seen someone already do it and thought about something while you saw them do it. So when you perform it, you've got a memory. Or you've done it yourself, and then later on you see someone else doing it, and it reminds you of what you were thinking when you did it. So it kind of goes backwards and forwards. And it definitely becomes this idea of reenacting the everyday. And it's not reenacting dramatic events, it's reenacting small things in different places. This is a scene I saw in Sydney, and this one is, for me, really strong. None of these people knew what was happening. Something quite bad had happened, but at this point, no one knew what was happening. So this whole street was kind of here looking up at this building. This became part of the piece. And these are people reenacting this moment in Hong Kong, in Liverpool. And then in the same street in Sydney, we actually managed to take it back to Sydney and have it re-performed in that moment. And for me, that was this sort of almost exactly what we were trying to do. It was suddenly back in the same place when the same moment was happening, and yeah, it brought everything in for us. Jean-Paul Thibault talks about Walkmans and mobile listening as the listening of elsewhere, of the listening to another place, because you're usually listening to a piece of music recorded from somewhere else, another time, another physical location. We're trying to counteract that, and we're trying to say that, okay, so we can write this music about where you are now. We can make this sound about where you are now. So it's the listening of here, even though it's a recording. The other thing that's, just to kind of finish up on the subtle mobs, is this sounds a really lofty way of saying it, or maybe slightly pretentious, but I think they're very democratic performances, because we're not even there half the time, actually. What we do is we invite people to sign up, so people sign up to take part. 2 days before the event, we send them an MP3, and we tell them an area of the city to go to, and we tell them to press play at a certain time. So when it starts, no one really knows who else is taking part. There's no meeting point, it's just an area. They don't have to go, there's no venue, there's no staff, there's no ushers, there's no framework of a show. The entire piece is then staged by the audience, who then become the performers as well. Once we send out the email, it's a little bit of a scary moment sometimes, because we realise that the moment we hit send and send out this information to however many hundreds of people are doing it, we can't stop it after that. We can't cancel the show, we can't change the location, we can't do anything. And in some places it's caused some quite large problems when things have happened in the world, but the audience kind of take it on and deal with that situation. And this is why I say now that we don't work in public space, we work in uncontrolled space, because public space is a difficult term that I might talk about at the end, but I say uncontrolled space because essentially that's what we're doing. We're just putting it out in the world, and whatever happens in the world we let feed into the piece. I'm going to skip. We started with slightly more complex subtle mobs, so we started trying to have 4 MP3s and interaction between people.
It is fine.
And the diagram got like that, and it got really complex, and we're not sure if it works yet. So I'm not going to talk about that yet. But the other thing that became kind of interesting, and it's a very loose idea at the moment, but is this idea of picking the context for the work. For a long time we thought, okay, we're making this piece, and then when we're putting it in a city, we're trying to find the location, and we're trying to find the right context for it. And I've started thinking about this the other way around now, that actually the piece is not the context, the world is the context for the piece. So what we're actually doing is we have this sound work, and we're trying to find the right place in the world that it fits into. But I'm trying to think of a better way to say that. No, there isn't a better way to say that. I haven't worked out yet. But it's a question about for me, what is true context? What is the context for this work in a physical and an urban environment? The thing that is also quite important about them, and it's what's different to the other work I'm going to talk about, is that these are, I think, quite authored works. Even though we don't control them once they happen, the audience do what they want to do, we're still making a 30-minute audio file that's fixed. We've sat there, we've kind of laboured over it, we've crafted it. We've decided when it begins and when it ends, because for me that's really how music works. It's a time-based medium, and knowing how long a crescendo is really important to making it work. And people talk about the works as kind of interactive, and it's a word I really don't like when I talk about the subtle mobs. I think the audience have to interact with the world, but they do that anyway, every day. You interact with the world all the time. We're not changing that interaction, we're just putting the soundtrack in there. So I think they're very, very authored works. So something else we started working on was a project called We Are Forests, which was a different approach to authoring. We basically decided we wanted to co-author pieces with an audience, rather than pre-making something in advance. We started with the question, what would you whisper in a stranger's ear? And we were kind of interested in the idea of intimacy in public spaces, intimacy with strangers, because what we were kind of seeing all the time is incredibly explicit and open conversations happening online. As Charlotte Groover says, it's suddenly we wanted to go, okay, what happens if you say these things to each other? What happens if you're actually speaking them to each other on the phone? Would you say the same things on Twitter or on Facebook as you would when you actually had to say them out loud to a stranger? And was there a kind of strength to the voice? So the piece we made was a performance work. It's a theatre work, I would say. And I'm going to describe the experience for you. That's what I'm going to do. That's the best way to do it. So, and then I'll explain a little bit more about the background. If you turned up to take part, you'd arrive at a market, a public market building. You'd be given a folded note, and you'd hand over your phone number. And you'd be instructed to sort of walk off into the market space. At a certain point, your phone would ring, and a voice would tell you that you were connected to X many people, 20 people, 15 people, however many other people had also turned up to the market space. This voice would play some kind of melancholy, there would be sort of melancholic music, giving a sort of cinematic soundtrack down the phone, and then you'd be invited to contribute your own description of the world, which it should sound... This is sort of what the intro sounds
Through
like.
this phone line, you are now connected to 15 people. At certain moments in your journey, you'll be asked to contribute your voice. You will do this by using the keypad on your phone. You'll receive further instructions when the time comes. Welcome to We Are Forests.
As you kind of describe things, you hear yourself describing, you hear other people describing them. The way things are described slowly changes over the course of the piece. And then it sort of becomes more and more intimate. I'll just skip forward to that. At one point, you're told that you're connected to just one other person, and you're invited to reveal something quite intimate to them, and you leave one message for that person and hear something back. Then the group is kind of guided towards the centre of the market. You're told to make your way to the centre of the marketplace, at which point two people put down their phones and begin singing all the things that people have said throughout the course of the piece. So all these descriptions of the moment suddenly become the moment itself. What's actually happening, and then the last bit, I almost forgot, the most important bit. So these people sing these moments, and then you're told again down the phone line to leave the market, and at a certain point to open the note that's in your pocket. And the note just tells you to hang up the call. What's actually happening in the piece is that initially you're asked to contribute something, and it's quite a big ask to suddenly just say to an audience, okay, you've got to now do the script, so say something interesting about the world. You know, that's a pressure that people don't want in a piece. So what we do is we put in some fake messages at the beginning, and we call these seeds, and they're our way of shaping the content of the piece. So when it starts and you're told you're connected to everyone, describe something around you, press 1 to record it. The first thing we do is we play in some single descriptions of what you heard there, broken window pane, a bowl of fruit, things that are in the space, but they're just single things. And audiences go, oh, that's what we do, just describe single things, I can do that. So they start contributing individual things, and you get this sort of copycat method. So then we start adding in longer descriptions, we start adding in descriptions of people, and then the audience go, oh, we're describing people now, okay. described from people, and so on and so forth. So we can kind of shape the narrative as it goes along by just leading them, as it were, until this kind of end point where the singers come in. And that moment of talking to one other person is, it's not actually real. We sort of wanted it to be real originally, but in the end we decided that's quite a difficult thing to ask someone to really open up and be intimate with someone else they don't know, to have this intimacy with a stranger. So we play them a fake message from someone, and they sort of, and it's quite an open, revealing sort of message, and they quite often say something back. We don't record what they say at that point, just from a moral standpoint, so we don't know what anyone said, but people have told us afterwards what they said. We didn't need to know that. But what's interesting for us is this kind of bleed between the physical space and this kind of sound space, what Gruber calls the virtual space of disclosure, where you have a world that's describing what's around you, but it just exists on this network, this phone network. And at the end, the moment where people are told to hang up the call, most people's response was that was a really difficult moment, that they didn't want to hang up because they felt that they were then breaking that second layer, and they were breaking it for everyone. Sort of like that, I've always thought about it like that moment when you're young and you're first on the telephone to your friends, and it's kind of, you hang up, no, you hang up, okay, no, you hang up. And people sort of said it was like being in a cinema and having a remote control, and feeling that if you hit stop, it stops for everyone. So people would really hold on for ages just listening to this silent network, because they built up this shared space that happened both in the market, just walking around looking at people, but also in these intimate conversations. And the crossover between the singers and and what you heard on the phones came about kind of through accident. When we first tested it in Amsterdam, we had music on the phone for different bits of the soundtrack. Sarah, part of our company, had written the violin piece. This guy was busking in the square in a different key to our piece. It sounded terrible. It was really out of tune. And you know, in our sort of, this is uncontrolled space, we have to deal with what's going on. I gave him some money and an MP3 player and said, okay, at this, when I give you the signal, press play on the MP3 player, start playing in tune with that. And for the audience, this was this kind of super strong moment where suddenly this busker had been going all the time through the piece, and you know, he was just part of the world. Suddenly this music starts playing on the phone, and suddenly he's playing along with it and in tune with it, and suddenly you kind of had this link between this virtual network and this physical space you were in, and we've got to do this. So this is why we brought the singers in, to start essentially kind of doing that, really doing that, taking the words that had been communicated through this network and then spreading them out into the moment. It was we worked with a really great programmer called Arjen Scherpennesser in Amsterdam. So we had a kind of a really nice system for sitting. We would kind of act as conductors, sitting up on the balcony of the market, watching everyone around and playing in the different sections and going, okay, now play in the sausage story. Okay, now play in the sister story. And it would also tell you when it wasn't working, and everyone would disconnect, and that was a bit of a problem. But but the system is also published. So if you want to do anything with a mass phone network, it's published on our website, so you can use it for doing other things that might be more interesting. I think the thing that we got to with this piece, though, that was for me quite important, was this sense that you can still have quite an authored structure. You know, we controlled when things happen at certain times, but input was coming in from the outside world, from the acoustic space and from the audience. And we wanted to use this real world sound, and this is what we're doing at the moment. So the work we're showing at the moment as part of Electrified, Tomorrow the Ground Forgets You Are Here, it sort of stems from this. It's kind of for me, it sits somewhere between the Subtle Mobs and We Are Forests. It's inspired by Wings of Desire, the Wim Wenders film, and the idea, the fiction is very simple. The idea is that you're invited to walk as an angel through the streets of Ghent and have this ability to hear people's thoughts. What it's allowed us to do though is we have these small devices we've built, and rather than just playing back the compositions we write, the musical compositions, they also have microphones on the outside and stupid amounts of wires inside. So what it does is it takes in the sound of the world, whether it's the buses, the bicycles, people talking, and it feeds them into the soundtrack and it remixes them as they go along. So a bicycle might suddenly become a drum rhythm, or someone's conversation might become resonated and become a harmony over the top of the violin. And you get this constant bleed between the sound world that's around you, the things happening around you, and this fictional space that we've created. And we get to change it as it goes along as well. So one of the benefits of kind of starting to shift to slightly more advanced technology systems is we can suddenly go, okay, let's turn off the real world and bring in our complete focused soundtrack, the same as the Subtle Mob. So we make the world really appear filmic, and then start slowly bringing back in parts of the world and pulling that into this virtual film you're seeing. I sort of don't want to say too much about it because it's on at the moment and you can go and do it still for the next 2 weeks. In the sweet shop, does anyone know where? Has people been to Electrified? It's full of bicycles. No? Next to the road? You gotta get involved with the culture in the city. Come on. If you want to go, it's next door to the road, and it's the shop's full of bicycles. You can go and pick up headphones Tuesday to Saturday. But the thing for me that I want to say that's really important about it is the link to cinema and the link to cinema soundtracks. So far I've been talking about this idea of kind of making cinematic experiences, and that's how we talk about everything. Michael Schion, who writes a lot about cinema sound, he always has this really bold statement that there is no soundtrack, there's no such thing as a soundtrack. The term soundtrack is a technical leftover from, on a reel of film, you'd have the part with the images on it, and you'd have the track of the film which had the sound on it. But we've kind of used the term soundtrack to describe what we hear in a film. Shion's argument is that a film soundtrack doesn't exist as a complete entity in itself. There is no sense in which it exists without the images. And I sort of like this because I feel like Tomorrow the Ground Forgets You Were Here, which is the piece with the microphones on the outside. For me, it's kind of the same. The sound of that piece doesn't exist without the visual and the physical world that happens around you when you're listening to it. With the Subtle Mobs, they can kind of exist as a sound piece on their own. People can just listen to the MP3 and sort of listen to these descriptions in this world. In Tomorrow the Ground, we don't really describe anything that's happening. We play back these thoughts, but essentially every sound that you're hearing in the music is being drawn from things that are happening around you, and if you don't see them, then it becomes a sort of off-screen sound, an acousmatic sound. Acousmatic sounds are, when you listen acousmatically, is when you don't know the source of a sound, and you're listening to it devoid of knowing what it is. And the problem is, you tend to spend most of your time trying to work out what that sound is, rather than actually listening to the qualities of the sound itself. So you hear this sort of ringing, doinging sound, and you think, is that a spring? Is that a car? Is that a bouncy ball? Rather than actually listening to the kind of texture and the sound of that spring. So what's happening in this piece for us is that you've got these microphones on the outside, so when you hear a sound, you can usually immediately identify what it was and really start hearing how it's making sound, the qualities of that sound. And it's also, for me, it's also a way of rethinking what the MP3 player can be, and the idea of how can we use headphone listening and mobile listening to force us to engage in the world, in the same way we were trying to do with the subtle mobs. So this idea that putting on headphones cuts you off from the world gets inverted in this piece. Because the microphones are there, you're putting on the headphones and it's actually amplifying the world, and it's kind of turning it up, and it's forcing you to be more engaged in what's going on. Because if you go somewhere really noisy, that's going to sound noisier in your ears. If you get into a fight with someone, that's a bad example actually. Which brings me back to this idea that it's counteracting the listening of elsewhere. So it's counteracting this idea that listening to music and sound on the move is a way of separating yourself from the world and turning off from the world. The last thing I just want to talk about is I'm very good at contradicting myself, just as a caveat to this. We're trying something else at the moment. We're trying to see what happens if we don't use any headphones and we put speakers out into the world. So we're currently making mobile orchestras with small speakers. So the audience, rather than being given a pair of headphones or an MP3 player, we're giving them a speaker. And actually, I'm going to play the video because it says it in subtitles in the video what I'm about to say. So hopefully that made sense from the video, but essentially each speaker plays a different part of the composition, and they all change what they're playing based on satellite positioning. So the audience moves as a group through the city, the sound changes depending how they move with each other, but it also creates a larger ensemble. I can't talk about this one that much yet, conceptually, just because for us it's really new and it's really hard to reflect on things when you're in the middle of kind of making them. So we've literally just made this and we're trying out a few different versions of it at the moment. But the thing that's just generally really interesting for us is that we're now dealing with making these cinematic scores and playing them to everyone. So it's not an internal experience. We're not going to stop making internal experiences, but this is a challenge to kind of make this shared cinematic space. Now everyone, even the people who aren't taking part, are suddenly brought into this composition, this film. And there's also a very different role for the audience. There's a much greater sense of being exposed and being embarrassed, maybe, or being afraid. We just did a slightly different version, but similar in Austria, and we took a group of school children out to try it. And the first time the speaker started making a noise, and we were still leading along, these two girls were just walking along going, kind of angst, no fear, no fear, no fear, it'll be okay. Like, I've never seen anyone so scared. And then when we left them, they loved it, and they started running around, kind of going, saying it in people's faces. But we haven't yet worked out this new contract with the audience, because our previous contract was easy. You put on a pair of headphones, no one knows what you're doing, you don't have to follow the instructions, you can do whatever you want. It's up to you to be as exposed or as private as you like. Now we've really changed that contract. We've said, here you go, do this, you're going to be the one making this piece now, and everyone's going to be looking at you. So we haven't quite worked that out yet, but essentially, for us it's still a kind of similar thing. It's still trying to make the world slightly different by giving it a soundtrack, changing the way you move through it, and without wanting to resort to cheesy quotes, I would kind of say that it still links into this Proust idea that you don't so much change the world as you change the way you see it. And that's where I'll stop and take questions. Thanks very much. Any questions?
So I was doing the thing today with the headphones and how much do you rely on like coincidence? Because I was having difficulty in whether thinking, is it scripted, this music, or is it like, because I was walking through the double set of automatic doors at the shopping mall, and the two lines came at this right time when the doors opened up.
There's a few things happening in it. One is it is location sensitive, so it does use GPS to trigger certain sections. So by the shopping centre and by a few different shops in different places, there are GPS triggers. So it changes one thing in the music. It also potentially triggers text. What else do we do in the shopping centre? I can't remember. I think it's just text and music in the shopping centre. But we rely on coincidence in almost everything we do, but coincidences aren't always coincidences in the sense that certain things tend to happen really often in certain places. So, and we really rely on that. So if we want to talk about, if we do a piece at a train station, we know that outside the train station taxis are always leaving. So we're going to put a bit of content that talks about a taxi leaving near the entrance to the train station, and then it's very likely that that will happen. And it's also, generally, when you talk about it, they've probably seen that happen there, so even if it doesn't happen right in front of them, they'll they'll have that kind of run. So we definitely rely on coincidence, but we try and rely on it sensibly in a way, with some level of control.
Yeah.
Basically, we want to control the whole world of everything. We just want to make it all do what we want it to do whenever we want it to do.
Because it was pretty cool, like, because I was actually sitting down listening to her, and she was talking about now there's somebody passing by in heels, and I really heard, because they took the microphone sound, and there was somebody walking by in heels, the click, clack,
Great.
so yeah, I guess it's just luck or...
Yeah, I guess there is a lot of luck, but yeah, we do try and shape it so that it, I mean, more than anything, I guess when we're writing, a rule that we always set for ourselves is that we leave space for the world to happen, because there's so much going on in the world all the time. If you fill your experience with stuff we've made up, there's no space for the rest of the world to happen. And if you make the gaps, then the world can happen and people see that as part of the piece, and it kind of sucks the piece in a way. I'd almost, I really am getting to the point where I'm thinking we're just going to be selling a ticket and opening the door and going, do what we made, and just sending people off to walk into the world. That would be so much easier to make than the other pieces.
Thanks.
God, everyone listened to this just this last moment.
Well, I was thinking, the principle you started with, like people using headphones to create their own worlds, or isn't like what you're doing right now, like amplifying everything around them? Isn't that the same thing that people tend to do or try to do with the headphones and the MP3 players?
I think generally no. I think the role of the MP3 players is to not, in some ways, pay attention to things. And I think it's kind of funny. It's there's something also about the way mobile tools have become more and more visual as well. There's a really interesting shift in people's neck positions over the last 15 years at train stations. Where you literally just, the amount of people that you see looking down at this screen before, the first time mobile phones, everyone had headphones on and it's up. But now it's, people will have the headphones on listening to the music, but at the same time as they're in that sound space, they're also in this other sort of network space there. And I also hope, I don't know whether it happens, but I also hope that there's an after effect from the work that by being in that place and hearing it, the next time you're there, you do pay attention to it a little bit more, because you have these memories of seeing it in this really sort of affected way. So I hope that we leave these traces around in people's experience of so I don't know if we do, but I mean that's the hope.
What's the difference between the uncontrolled space and the public space?
There's a trend that I really noticed in the UK, which I get the feeling is also happening here, where people build private spaces to look like public spaces. So they put the grass in, and they put the benches in, and they make it look like a public land, like a park, except that it's actually private. And what's problematic then is that your experience in that space has the possibility of being controlled in ways that it shouldn't be in what we think of as public space. You can be instantly told you can't be there because it's owned by someone else. You instantly can't do things that you would be able to do in public spaces. The reason I kind of avoid saying public space now with a lot of our work is that we don't ask for permission to do them. We never ask for permission to show the pieces, because we say that with the speaker piece, actually that's not entirely true. We did start talking to people about that. But with all the headphone-based work, we've never asked for permission, because they're supposed to integrate with the world, and they're supposed to just be what happens anyway. And what becomes interesting is when you start doing those in private spaces. For example, in the UK, you can't do things in train stations without permission. We've done numerous pieces in train stations now, and I'm really interested in this idea that I'd love to see someone try and stop the piece happening in a train station when every audience member is an independent individual doing what you should be allowed to do in a train station, which is have a look around and listen to a piece of audio. But suddenly, oh, but if you're doing this as part of a show, you can't do this. So then police would have to stop every single person with headphones on and ask them what they were listening to, and then decide that if they were listening to the same thing as everyone else, they were involved in something that shouldn't be happening, and so remove them. I don't know, there's tensions around the use of public space that I find really interesting, and so we kind of, and some other works, not so many of these, but some of the games we've designed kind of specifically push those kind of boundaries, but it means that I find it weird to talk about making these in public space, even though they look like public space, because it's a bit of a loose term these days. And I think it's a problem. I think we're losing public space all the time, and I worry that we don't notice that we're losing it all the time. And there can be an instant moment when everyone goes, actually, you can get in your car and you can get on the train. Well, hopefully you can get on the train. But that's it. You're not allowed to go anywhere else unless you've got permission or you've got the pass or you've paid your extra fee or something. I sound like a revolution now. Stop. We did have, as our most beautiful moment in the train station was someone who had their MP3 player. We saw them afterwards. They said, "Oh, I took part in your piece, but my MP3 player ran out of batteries, so I thought I'd take some photos." And taking photos in UK train stations is an absolute no-no. And the police instantly came up to him and searched him, asked him what he was doing. Proper terror suspect. Took his ID, and he said, "Oh, I'm taking photos of this event," and they're looking around. And he said that they wanted to see his photos, so we showed them the photos, and they said, "These are just photos of people in the train station, so have you been drinking?" So, "No, there's this event." I said, "Events aren't allowed to happen in the train station." They made him delete all the pictures and escorted him out of the train station. Well, at that moment there were, I think we had about 320 people around taking part in this piece. So, I mean, not great for him, but for us, amazing. We were like, that's it, it's the perfect invisible piece. The police didn't notice. And they're trained for it. They're totally trained for it. But we know that because when we were making that piece, we spent a lot of time talking to security guards and police officers in train stations to talk to them about what it is, how they notice changes in behaviour and the different things what it is that they look out for when they know someone's being suspicious. We had an alternative excuse about why we were asking them these things, but for us it was to make sure that every instruction we were giving the audience were things that don't alert the people to you being strange. We were getting them to do exactly what people are supposed to do in train stations, from looking at departure boards, going to shops, just always making sure they were doing those things. So. Any other questions? I feel like if I do this, someone will ask me again, I'm never going to get to close the laptop. Thanks. Okay, thanks very much.